we return to a subject that is of great consequence, but may not always be headline material: education. We've devoted an episode before to the scandal of learning poverty, and another episode to the hopeful work of the Second Congressional Commission on Education. Tonight, we focus on early childhood education. Almost 3 out of every 10 children below 5 years old are stunted. According to UNICEF, some 27 out of every 1,000 children do not even live past age 5. How can we form a healthy, educated citizenry, fully adapted to the 21st century, on such a weak foundation? Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are in the public square. We are joined tonight by a commissioner and a member of the Second Education Commission's Standing Committee for Early Childhood and Basic Education. Representative Jose Francisco Kiko Benitez was a university president, one of the few PhDs in Congress, and is now on his second term as representative of the 3rd District of Negros Occidental. Ms. Amabel Mobsy Carino was principal of Miriam College's Child Study Center and is now principal of Miriam's Skills Development and Technical Education Center. Kong Kiko, Teacher Mobsy, thank you for joining us in the public square.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with a question for the two of you, but first Kong Kiko and then Teacher Mobsy. So we will focus on early child care and development. But can we start the discussion by talking about the context, setting our discussion in the context of the work of EDCOM? Like I've said, we've had Senator Sherwin Gatchalian join us in a previous episode. So we have a general idea of what EDCOM is doing. But in relation to early childhood education, what is the context which we should understand?
So EDCOM actually has, as you know, 4 co-chairs. No, 2 from the Senate and 2 from the lower house. They are the chairs on the Committee on Higher Education and the chairs of the committees on basic education. And then there are, in addition, 3 more senators and 3 more congressmen. In addition, there are subcommittees within EDCOM. One of which is the Basic Education and Early Childhood Subcommittee, within which, for early childhood, I and Senator Pia Cayetano co-chair. We have as our members of the Standing Committee and the Advisory Committee, Ms. Oli Lucas of ENET, Mayor Lani Cayetano of Taguig, of course, Professor Carino, and Rina Lopez of Knowledge Channel, right? Together, what we do is we hold hearings and so on to review data and studies with regards to early childhood care and development, to figure out what might be the short-term solutions that we could do, as well as the longer-term structural issues that might require more major realignments, right? In order to ensure, in fact, that children enter the basic education system as ready as they possibly can.
Was it a technical decision to include early childhood education and basic education in the same subcommittee, or there was no debate over that?
There was no debate over that, I think. I think the development of the ECCD Council, for example, presupposes that preschools are really that. They are preschools. And so their end goal is to get children ready for schooling. And therefore, it wasn't a major debate to ensure that, in fact, the alignment between the rollout of policies and guidelines for early childhood education is one that is, in fact, aligned with what DepEd requires and expects.
We can go back to that
Sure.
A little later, talking about the alignment between early education objectives and basic education objectives. I hope you don't mind if I call you how your students call you, Teacher Mobsy. What does a member of the standing committee do? I mean, you're all very busy people also, right? So like, what kind of contribution do the members of the standing committee and the advisory council also make?
First of all, I'm very happy that EDCOM has included early childhood care and development in the conversation, because investing in early childhood is also an investment for the future. So, going back to your question regarding what do the standing committee members do, we hold consultations with stakeholders, so that includes other early childhood educators, other agencies who are working hand in hand for early childhood care and development. So that includes the ECCD Council, it includes other NGOs like UNICEF, Save the Children, and we're also looking at benchmarking with other child development centers. So that includes the Bulilit centers, which are model daycare centers, and we'd like to know what their best practices are and what their pain points are also.
Just a quick note, ECCD Council, that would be the Early Childhood Care and Development
Council.
Councils, right? Yeah. Teacher Mobsy, when you were asked or volunteered to join the standing committee, did you have something specific in mind? Like, oh, okay, I want to push this particular initiative or this particular innovation?
Basically, just to put early childhood care and development in the spotlight.
Okay.
Because for the longest time, we're talking about basic education and the focus is on kindergarten up to 12, K to 12. But nothing is heard much about early childhood. But these are the foundational years, and these are the important years that ground all the learning that will happen also in basic education. So as an early childhood educator, I'm very, very happy and excited to share all these ideas and to touch base also with my early childhood educators.
Kong Kiko, can we talk about the national or the social context? No, there was a survey that found out that almost 3 out of every 10 children below 5 years old are physically stunted, and I think the assumption is that they are also mentally challenged or stunted at that point. How did we reach this point? I mean, was this like a slow decline over decades, or was there a crisis? Or
I don't think there was a necessarily crisis. No, I think the problem has been there for a while. It's just been exacerbated, and now we're finally paying attention, right? In a way that I think we perhaps were not before. Although, if you look at the number of bills, for example, that have to do with supplementary feeding and maternal health and so on, this has been an issue for a while, right? I think currently, obviously, the major fear, and one that is pertinent to EDCOM specifically, is whether or not this has gotten worse because of the pandemic, right? So 2018, for example, the statistics suggest that 52% of our households nationwide are food insecure.
okay, 52%.
And that in 2021, I believe, or thereabouts, it rises to over 60%. Right? So that's a general indication of just the well-being of how, in fact, families are able to feed themselves and their individual members, including children, right? It is obviously quite alarming, because stunting is really about height, right? Whether they are at the right height for their age. But it becomes a general indicator of all the other nutritional deficiencies that a child may have. And for particularly for 0 to 5 or 0 to 6, that's when the mental capacities, right, are at their most pliable. So the brain development is fastest and so on. And that's when they need the foundational mental capacities, so that when they go into school, we don't want them to be already deficient, right, to begin with. So I think the issue is really how to ensure that we can address the issue of nutritional deficiencies.
Okay.
Yeah, across the board. And one of the things that has come out from EDCOM is that the government has tried to do this across different agencies. And perhaps it is time to now review the ecosystem of our supplementary feeding programs and so on and so forth to see whether or not their impact can be tracked appropriately to address these astounding statistics. It's actually 28.8% of our children are stunted. There is really no reason or excuse for that.
Just a quick follow-up, 28.8%, I think that's from a PIDS
Yes.
survey of 2019. Do you see it as part of EDCOM's work to commission a new survey, or are the baselines set? I mean, you have a pretty good idea already of what you're dealing with.
So there are studies that are being asked and requested by EDCOM now so that there is evidence base.
Okay.
There has been another 2023 PIDS study.
Okay.
And that's actually where the 28.8% comes from.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It was a little higher, I think, in 2018. So there has been a slight improvement, but very, very slight.
Okay.
What it has emerged is the difficulty in even tracking, right, the impact of for example, how many students or how many children receive supplementary feeding, how many take part in the programs, how much is spent. Is the food given to them actually nutritious, and does it create the kind of nutritionally sound, right, children? All of that is still, in fact, being asked now, and the ECCD Council itself is coming up with their own information system to ensure that the information that they gather for the kind of interventions and the impacts that these interventions have can be clearly tracked over time.
Okay.
So all of that is just now, in fact, being done.
I see.
Because if we talk about 0 to 4 or 0 to 5, for example, right, we have a Early Years Act that divides 0 to 8 between ECCD Council supervision and DepEd, right? We also have the first 1,000 days, right? And that one really is under DOH. And it's primarily maternal care, which is 0 to 2, right? And then we have the daycare centers, which is under DSWD, which is really 3 to 4, right? So different agencies
That's right.
have to kind of come together with their interventions and coordinate across to ensure that two things. First, obviously, that funds are not wasted, right? That they are synergistic and complementary to each other in terms of intervention from government. But perhaps most importantly, that the children, in fact, get the nutrition that they need and they deserve. Otherwise, the feeding programs miss the mark, right? Regardless of whether or not you implement them. If, in fact, stunting is the primary concern.
Teacher Mabsi, you have more than 20 years of experience in early childhood education. From your experience, what are the effects of stunting? I mean, and are those effects irrevocable or they can be reversed?
Stunting is a result of poor nutrition. So it results also in impaired growth, and it affects cognitive abilities of children. It affects their behavioral abilities, and it affects everything. So to be able to address this early, you will be able to lay down the foundation for them to have the correct skills, the abilities for them to succeed later on in life. So it's very important that we address food and nutrition. It's actually one of the priority areas of the ECC, the Early Childhood Care and Development Standing Committee of EDCOM. It's crucial and it needs to be addressed. And the way we address it needs to be intentional. Like Congressman Kiko said a while ago, we have all these agencies coming together, but it has to be synergistic and it needs to be collaborative also in nature, because we have to put all these young children at the center of everything that we do.
But are the effects reversible?
Sadly, no. You can catch up, but why catch up if you can address it early on? So I don't believe in fixing the problem later on in life, but if we address it later on, we will save a lot in terms of energy and finances and resources. So might as well address it early on. So it's good that this is a priority area.
If, for instance, EDCOM is able to establish like a really good program or a series of programs addressing precisely this need, so then this particular generation, would enjoy the benefits of that. But would we be talking of like a lost generation, or maybe more than one generation that has to play catch up, or otherwise really they'll really be left behind?
Yes.
The short answer is yes.
The short answer is
Sadly.
yes.
Yeah.
I think the major issue is, in fact, when you have a department like DepEd, you have an implementing arm whose reach is nationwide. So the fear is not catch up for 5 to 8, for example, right? Because you can have mechanisms. You intensify the supplementary feeding program of the schools.
Okay.
You increase the milk feeding program of Department of Agriculture, and so on and so forth. But the pathway for that delivery is DepEd itself, right? For early childhood, we do not have something that is as stable, as institutionally continuous, I suppose, or as pervasive
As DepEd.
as this DepEd, right? Which is really part, I think, of the problem. And again, depending on the age, different agencies are responsible for it. So, can you play catch up? Yes, but even catch up, it means decreasing the deficiency by, a certain percentage, right? You never fully catch up.
Yeah.
And stunting is, even if they get taller, for example, as they get older, that is no longer an indication per se of their mental capacities. Right? So you want to make sure that the children that enter school are as ready, right, with as much ability as you possibly can give them. So have we a couple of lost generations? I'd have to say probably, yeah, who are not performing at their best. Can they perform better? Sure. We can probably do catch up, as Professor Carino has said, but catch up is not at their best either. So there's a certain urgency, right? Because the longer you wait for these interventions to be done, comprehensively and systematically, the less certain you are of this catch-up game that you're playing. And we are talking about generations.
Yeah. Teacher Mabsi, one of the things that struck me preparing for this interview was another finding of that same PIDS study that shows, was it like 98% of Filipino parents think that 0 to 5 is too early to start studying. I mean, wow. And secondly, I did not realize there was a cultural factor at play here also, not only institutional or financial and so on. how do we address that problem? So that's a major obstacle, I would guess, right? I mean, if the parents themselves don't, well, okay, there's a daycare center, there's a very good, part-time teacher, but dito lang sa bahay, parang, how do we even address that?
Actually, it's the same for both private and public schools. The
Okay.
parents feel that their children are too young to early to enter preschool. They would rather wait for the mandatory kindergarten level
Okay.
for their children to enter school. So how do we address this? We need to have parent campaigns.
Okay.
I think that's number one, to inform parents how crucial early childhood care and development is. It's not formal learning. It's exposing them to developmentally appropriate learning experiences. So this includes, showing respect, saying good morning, greetings, being able to socialize, being able to manage their own feelings. So those are areas that, can be stimulated in a preschool setting. And that's why we need the parent support, definitely. And just going back also to stunting, probably the parents feel that their children are too young because they're small, because they're stunted in growth. So they feel, ay, bata pa anak ko. So they would rather wait.
And you say that this cultural resistance, you can also find it even among parents of private school.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, don't they send their schools, their children to, Montessori at the age of 3 or what? No. So,
It could be also a problem of a challenge for finances because it's not mandatory anyway.
that's right.
So what would be good to put in place is to, again, focus on early childhood and its importance. And one way to do it is through EDCOM 2, and show, these are the crucial years. These are the foundational years that will lead to, better growth and preparation for kindergarten onwards.
Kong Kiko, Teacher Mabsi, can we point to, successes elsewhere in the world? I think that kind of, the power of example might help a lot in such a campaign, no, among parents. Like, which societies place such a value on early education that their parents, the parents willingly send their kid, or send their kids to, I don't know, what, daycare or some form of that kind of intervention, and it reflects in general well-being or the state of their economy and so on.
Here in the Philippines, we do have successes also.
Oh, that's
so,
great. Okay.
Learning doesn't have to be in a formal preschool setting. It can be done home-based. It can be done community-based. So if the parents feel that they do not want to be away from their children for a few hours of the day, you can definitely have parent training for home-based programs. So you teach parents how to, have stimulating activities that they can do at home, have them do chores, have them prepare the plates and the forks for dinner time. Those are simple activities that are actually learning activities.
Okay, it's something just occurred to me. I think that in sheer number of cell phones, I think there's more than one per Filipino. But would you recommend that they, like a 2-year-old toddler learning to use a cell phone, or is that too early for them to use that kind of device? I mean, I think there's literature on that, right?
There is literature on that. But of course, what's important is to have interactive activities. You cannot interact. The phone cannot talk to you.
Okay.
It's just receptive, but it has to be, you have to be able to actively communicate with a human being that shows emotion. And
Okay, so that's not part of the solution.
no, no. Well, there are some that some parents do use technology as a support, but we would still, early childhood educators will still focus on interaction and communication and building on the language skills with human people.
Kong Kiko, what is the role of government in early education? I mean, daycare centers, would that be one? And so, I mean, and do daycare centers work?
So that's part of what EdCom is looking at now,
okay.
right? As you know, daycare centers fall under DSWD. Sorry. And we are trying to move daycare centers from sort of child minding centers to become, in fact, child development centers.
Yeah.
And that shift requires many things. And as daycare centers, the answer is not enough, right? There's not enough input into what they do. But as they shift towards child development centers, then yes. But the percentage are so small. So there are, I think, 14-15% of LGUs don't even have daycare centers, right? And then of the daycare centers of the remaining that exist, the number of them capable of becoming, in fact, accredited and basically shifting to an early childhood care and development center are even fewer, right? So one of the interventions that EdCom is looking at is how to increase the number of such centers, you know, that can abide by early childhood principles, right? So that they, in fact, become a holistic center for children's growth. But the other side is you can do that from the government side, but as you said, 90% don't send their children, right? So then you have to have additional programming to reach those 90% that are not sending their children to daycare centers, right? So that's part of the problem that I had mentioned earlier, where for school-based feeding programs, you have DepEd. For preschool, you don't even have enough daycare centers or children enrolled in daycare centers. One of the things that the ECCD Council tried to do is to create neighborhood play support groups, right? So instead of daycare centers per se, organize children in neighborhood plays and use that as a forum or an avenue to conduct home-based programming and intervention so that parents understand the principles of development, the principles of nutrition, right? And so forth. That seems to be rather successful and one that, in fact, UNICEF in one of our hearings was recommending as a best practice from other countries, just to respond to your question. But again, we're just starting, right? And rolling that out, I think, will require time. And hopefully, once we do so, we will see an improvement in the measurements, right, that we take vis-a-vis stunting or school readiness.
Teacher Mabsi, in transforming daycare centers from babysitting or child minding hubs into child development centers, what needs to happen? What should we see in a daycare center that will make us think, okay, this is geared towards development, not just child minding?
There will be stimulating activities. There will be a schedule in a day so that there is routine being built throughout the day. So you have a chunk of it will be on play. So the power of play is really very important. Giving them that opportunity to have solitary play and parallel play and social play, it's very powerful.
Because the point is really school readiness, right? So
learning to learn.
Learning to learn, right? And school readiness is not about academic skills. It's about learning in a group. So just to echo, this is why a phone is insufficient. Right? It's not that you shouldn't teach them through the phone, but that's not the benchmark of readiness. It's really, can they play with other children? Can they insert themselves into social situations? How is their dexterity, right? Their capacity for picking up things and putting things in the right bucket and so on. So these are the kinds of things that, in fact, children naturally learn to do through play. So it's a very different set of criteria from what we would expect first graders or even kindergartners per se to be able to do. And yet, they should build on each other, right? So there should be a as seamless track as possible between preschool and school.
But in terms of staffing, okay, so somebody needs to be in charge of the stimulating activities. Somebody needs to maybe prompt particular plays or games, and so on. Who would it still be DSWD? Would we need more from DepEd, or do we bring in the ILG because they're in, it's the barangays we're talking about?
The answer is yes to all of the above.
All of the above.
Right. The need is really to rationalize what we expect from daycare workers.
Okay.
Right. So one of the first steps is to perhaps stop calling them daycare workers.
Okay.
Right, and call them child development teachers and child development workers. There is a bill currently in the lower house for a Magna Carta for daycare workers,
Okay.
which includes the kind of expectations for training, security of tenure and flotilla positions, and so on and so forth. Because right now they are like the BHWs, who are technically volunteers, right, being given an honorarium or an allowance. If government is serious about giving them or spending for training, for example, then perhaps they should have security of tenure so that when the barangay captain changes,
That's right.
they don't change the daycare worker, and then you have to once again train them. Right? So with increased expectations in terms of outputs from our child development centers, there should also be equal protection, right, to the actual people conducting this, right? Most of our daycare workers are high school graduates, right? Some of them are even college graduates, but they think of themselves really as volunteers, right? So this is part of the work of the ECCD Council to create the kind of guidelines necessary. At the end of the day, the government agency which has the largest reach on the ground, as you have said, is the ILG, right? It's the barangay itself. So they have to be part, first of all, of the ECCD Council, and they have to understand that shift from daycare workers to child development workers and child development teachers. And they need to invest, right? The necessary money required to ensure that this happens. But again, that is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So in addition to the larger cultural issue of parents not sending their children to daycare centers, right? Let's say preschool is a 2-hour affair, because that's the extent that you expect, or 3 hours of the day. Yeah, but for me, the mother, to bring my child to the daycare center, I have to pay for transportation. It takes me an hour to get there. Right? By the time I get home, I have to leave again to come back to pick my child up. So I end up sitting there and waiting, right? So my day is shot, right? So I would rather keep the child home, where I can still do whatever it is I need to do, or go to work for that matter if I'm working from home.
That's right.
Then spend that time going back and forth, right? So that is just the tip of the iceberg. So the daycare workers and the daycare, or the child development workers and the child development teachers should be part of a holistic program that also includes barangay nutrition scholars, right? Barangay health workers, for example, in a comprehensive attempt to ensure that the well-being or the wellness of the child, both educationally and nutritionally or health-wise, is properly addressed across the different agencies. Right? Because on the ground, it is the DILG and the barangay that in the end needs to implement. Right? They become the crucible through which all these different agencies, DSWD, DOH, DepEd, must work in conjunction with.
Okay.
Right?
Let's talk about money. No? both public sector funding and private sector participation. I realized that you're dealing with such a major problem with, very large consequences. And it's important to, I don't know, think big. But do you also already, in your discussions now, think about money? Like, okay, ideally,
We always do.
yeah, so, yeah, so, I don't know how to phrase this, but when it comes to funding, do you find yourselves maybe limiting yourselves to more practical
Yes.
innovations?
Depends on what you call practical. So it helps that Senator Angara is a commissioner of EDCOM, so that the finance committee of the Senate is involved and they see it right away. It helps that those defending the budgets, right, primarily, at least in the Senate, for the education sector are also commissioners, right? There's Senator Joel Villanueva, there's Senator Pia Cayetano, and so on. But because it's a budgetary issue, there's always a balancing act. And the balancing act has to do with, first of all, how much money is there? Second of all, how to portion it out to the different priorities, because obviously early childhood care and development is not the only EDCOM issue that needs to be properly funded. There is, for example, senior high school, there is tulong-dulong in tertiary, and so on. There is TESDA, right? And each of these have a role to play in the ecosystem of the education sector. And the third is, how can you, with reasonable certainty, feel that the agencies will in fact implement the budgets properly? Because if they are unable to do so, then you're better off putting the money of the government somewhere else where they can be used efficiently and properly. So those three things are taken into account by the EDCOM commissioners. And the sum total of that is obviously kind of, okay, pragmatically, how much can the ECCD Council take on, right? In terms of their own, what the DBM calls absorptive capacity, right? What is the largest universe, right, that we need? So, for example, for the supplementary feeding program for 2024, there is a move to double it from this year. But even doubling it will not be quite enough, right, to reach the universe of the feeding that needs to be done. So it's short by around, I think, 5.6 billion pesos pa, right? But doubling it for next year and seeing if, in fact, it gets disbursed and implemented properly, right, is, I think, what the commissioners are asking. And if it is, in fact, absorbed appropriately and disbursed efficiently, then we can lobby and push for even more funds the subsequent year. So you have to balance the slow burn of that against the urgency and the emergency of a lost generation.
Teacher Mabsi, in your experience, would it be within the realm of possibility to convince companies, for instance, to help out in feeding programs? Maybe they can adopt a school district or something. Is that something possible?
Definitely. We're also looking at low-lying fruits. So we need to touch base also, the LGUs need to touch base also with private institutions, private companies. And there are schools like Miriam College who also engage in advocacy work with regard to teacher training for child development workers. So we're also looking at the possibility of state universities and colleges for their scholars who finish early childhood education to do a return service in daycare centers. So those are some ideas that we can think of creatively and maximize to the fullest.
I forgot to ask this earlier, but in your experience, 20 plus years in early childhood education, how would you characterize the changes over that time? has the situation deteriorated, or are there signs of progress?
With regard to early childhood, it was very much traditional before. So we're talking about years back. It's on rote memorization, but now early childhood has become more experiential, more hands-on. So there's also a shift in the mindset of the educators that everything needs to be deliberate. It needs to address the developmental needs of the learner. So again, this means that putting the learner at the center of all the plans, putting the learner at the center of the curriculum, so that we address the needs of each learner.
I assume that reflects the latest research, no? On how best to educate 0 to 5, right? So the learner in the center of all that, something like a tactile environment, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, we're running long, so maybe just one last question. Kong Kiko, you filed House Bill 8393 seeking the alignment of early education and basic education. I was going to ask you, but then I read your very thorough explanatory material, no? Which is like, okay, this is not the usual Senate or House bill. It's like 2 pages, very tightly reasoned. So I found out there that, in fact, this is a counterpart bill. And so I get the sense that the commissioner, the senators, and congressmen who are commissioners, part of EDCOM 2, are working on parallel paths, no? Doing all these things together. Can you talk to us about that bill?
Sure.
What do you hope to achieve with that?
So the first is obviously an alignment between the expectations of DepEd and what we might expect early childhood centers, care and development centers to have as their outcomes, right, or their outputs. There are provisions in there to, exactly as you have mentioned, ensure that the DILG is a vice chair of the council.
Okay.
So that there is membership and representation from the DILG. Another aspect of the bill is, in fact, to insist on plantilla positions for child development workers and teachers within the barangays, and to provide them with a certain amount of security of tenure. It tries to align in many ways the programming of ECCD centers and to ask for more national ECCD centers that might be clustered and become examples, right, for how other what are now daycare centers might aspire for. That's the general gist of the bill, and it is a counterpart bill to Senator Gatchalian's bill and Senator Angara's bill in the Senate. And you're right. As part of our low-hanging fruit type of action, when certain interventions seem to be very clear, commissioners in the lower house and commissioners from the Senate do file simultaneously parallel bills to speed up the legislative process, on the assumption that legislation is necessary, right? But aside from that, we do also have recommendatory, if you like, avenues. So I, for example, have been in contact with Secretary Gatchalian of the DSWD, as has Senator Win Gatchalian, obviously, right? With concerns about the feeding program, the food stamp program of the DSWD, the zero hunger program of the government, and so on, and how these might directly address this issue of stunting and malnutrition among children. DSWD obviously has a larger, in many ways, scope, and they're very clear that they are piloting it now, and they are hoping to reach the food insecure families and households, and they will try to track how many of these households that they're targeting in the food stamp program can, in fact, as well see if there's an impact in their statistics on stunting and malnutrition among children from 0 to 5. The assumption there is that those who are stunted will belong to the target families that the SWD is identifying.
Yeah. Kong Kiko, just a quick follow-up. The bill, as I read it, sounds like, okay, everybody should be for it. I mean, do you see any kind of resistance? What would prevent it from becoming law?
The resistance might come from the complexity of giving plantilla positions to child development workers.
Okay.
Because there are budgetary issues,
Okay.
right? And certain municipalities won't be able to afford it, basically, right? Because if you give them plantilla positions, then do they become civil service eligible folks? Do they become LGU employees? If so, what kind? There are certain things that follow, right? Once you change their categories. So those are the primarily more difficult
Okay.
positions. The other ones are implementation, right? In the overlap between DSWD, DepEd, and ECCD Council, for example, what is the lookout of the council? So as a council, they're really just there for policy. So who's going to implement the council's policies, the guidelines for pedagogical approaches for play or learning through play, for example? Will it be DSWD? Will it be the barangay? Right? Those kinds of things, those are not resistance to passing it as legislation per se, but those might be the kinks, right, in the proper implementation of the law.
All right. Teacher Mabsi, the last word to you. Looking at this now, it seems to me that there might be a great opportunity here for new early childhood educators. I mean, obviously there's a need, and there's an urgent need for us to address the stunting in the very early years. Now, if there's institutional, maybe financial support from both the government and maybe some private sector institutions, we might be looking at, I don't know, like a golden age of early childhood education. What are you looking for? Who would make a good early childhood educator? I mean, we need people like them to make all of this happen.
A good childhood educator has a good grasp of what learning should look like for young children. So it has to have, each educator should have an understanding what their developmental milestones are so that we can maximize on those early years. Somebody with good humor.
Patience.
Patience, yes.
How about language?
Language, well,
It has to be mother tongue, or what makes it work?
mother tongue, yes. It will, yes, definitely. Mother tongue also has value with regard to the language used in the classroom. But more than that, I think it's the compassion of a teacher to connect with a student and to address the needs of each learner.
Thank you. You know, some of the issues involved in early childhood education, care and development are new to me. So you might say I'm having an early education year myself. Thank you very much, Congressman Kiko Benitez and Principal and Teacher Mabsi Carino. Our conversation serves to remind us that the health and vigor of a vibrant public square depends very much on a healthy and well-educated citizenry. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for us tonight. As always, the next step for engaged citizens is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.